Introduction to Incoterms 2020. My name is Adam Mook with Logistics Plus Incorporated. In today's session, we're going to introduce Incoterms. We're going to discuss the overview of the 11 Incoterm rules in the current 2020 version, and we're going to discuss preparing export quotations. Introduction to Incoterms 2020. Incoterms were first published by the International Chamber of Commerce in the year 1936. Since then, versions have been updated by the ICC approximately every 10 years. The current Incoterms 2020 version came into effect as of January 1st, 2020. It's important to remember that exporters and importers around the world may use any current or previous version of Incoterms as long as the version used is clearly identified in the sales contract. The Incoterms 2010 rules revisions had modified the 13 total rules that were in the 2000 version to 11 total Incoterms rules in the current 2020 version. It's important to note that there is a clear differentiation between the omnimodal, meaning any mode of transportation for the main carriage of the shipment, versus those intended only for marine use. For example, we will learn today that FOB Incoterm rule should be used only for marine use, whereas Ex-Works or FCA or CPT, for example, can be used for any mode of main carriage transportation. The preambles to each Incoterms rule have been expanded to better inform users of its intended use, and a copy of the official publication for Incoterms 2020 can be purchased right off of the International Chamber of Commerce website, which you see the link on your screen for the website to purchase the publication. There are various contractual obligations and terms and conditions of sale needed to perform an international sales transaction. So within that contract of sale, you have things such as payment terms, when and where you're transferring title from the seller to the buyer, etc. And it's important to note that Incoterms relate only to the contract of sale. And the Incoterms rules by themselves are only doing two things for the parties in the transaction. The first that they're doing is identifying who has responsibility for any risk or loss of damage to the goods in transit. And the second aspect, they're telling the seller and the buyer who's paying for the freight costs, meaning who's paying for the pre-carriage inland freight, who's paying for the main carriage port-to-port freight, and who's paying for the on-carriage freight once the goods have been delivered into the buyer's country. So those are the only two things the Incoterm rules tell us: who's paying for the freight cost and up until what point, and who has risk if the goods are lost or damaged in transit, and up until what point does that risk transfer from the seller to the buyer. The last bullet point on this slide states that no matter what country you're in or what language an importer or exporter speaks, Incoterms are universal across the world, and they are used by countries all over the world. So Ex-Works, for example, DDP, they all have the same meaning no matter what country you're in, no matter what language you speak. We mentioned that the Incoterm rules tell the exporter and the buyer two things: who's responsible for paying for the freight costs, who's arranging for that freight between pre-carriage, main carriage, and on-carriage, and then who has the risks. So in other words, at some point, the seller has obligation to make carriage arrangements in certain Incoterm rules, and then from that point, the buyer has to make other carriage arrangements. And for the costs and risk between the buyer and the seller, at some point, some of the freight costs the seller pays for, and other freight costs, at a certain point, it becomes the buyer's responsibility to pay for the freight. And so the Incoterm rule, each of the Incoterm rules tell us very clearly whose responsibility it is and when to arrange for the carriage, pay for the carriage, and who's taking on the risk for loss or damage. As a reminder, it's important to note that transferring ownership or title of the property from the seller to the buyer is a separate aspect of your contract. Incoterms have nothing to do with the transfer of title, nor do Incoterms have anything to do with your payment terms or revenue recognition in your financial books. In other words, how you get paid by the buyer, whether it's cash in advance, letter of credit, documentary collection, extending credit, payment terms are separate aspects of your sale. Also, Incoterm rules do not deal with, in the preambles of the rules, they do not have anything to do with liability from the case of unexpected or unforeseeable events. And then by themselves, Incoterms do not specify how goods are to be packed for shipment or how they are to be specifically loaded and stowed onto transport equipment, meaning in a container, on a truck, rail, car, aircraft, or ocean vessel. On this slide, you'll see a graph of the 11 total rules in the Incoterms 2020 current version. On the left side of your screen, we have the rules that can be used for any mode of transportation. And on the right side, highlighted in blue to kind of visualize water, we have those that are used for ocean or inland waterway transport only. Here on this slide, we can see how Incoterm rules should be written on your commercial invoices and in your sales contracts. So you're always going to begin with the 3-letter abbreviation of each rule. So for example, X works, EXW is a rule. FCR, cost and freight, is a rule. DAP, delivered at place, is a rule. So you first write the 3-letter abbreviation for each of the Incoterm rules. And then next to that, you're going to have either a named place or named port of shipment. And then following your named place or named port, you are going to put the current or previous version of Incoterm rules you're using. So for example, you see on this slide, it's listing Incoterms 2020, which is the current version of each of the rules. But remember that buyers and sellers are free to use any previous version. So if somebody wanted to use DAP delivered at place from the Incoterms 2010 version, they would notate Incoterms 2010, and both parties would have to know how DAP was used if it were different from the current version to the previous version. If in your sales contract or on your commercial invoices, there's no indication of the year version of the Incoterms, by default, it goes to the current version, which in our case, currently, as of January 1st, 2020, is Incoterms 2020 version. Continuing on with this slide, we will see the 11 total rules are listed from top to bottom, going in order of the most advantageous rule from the perspective of the seller, and then the opposite, going from bottom to top, are the rules that are most advantageous from the perspective of the buyer. So we have at the top, we have one rule in what's called the departure category, X works. So in X works, the seller virtually has no risk or costs for the transport of the goods, which is why we consider it the most advantageous from the seller's perspective. They're not paying for any freight and they're not having any risk. As soon as they make the goods available to be packaged and to come get picked up by the carrier nominated by their customers and their forwarder, they notify the notified party, goods come get picked up, they have no risk or cost from that point. Whereas the opposite, all the way at the bottom, DDP, delivered duty paid, the seller is paying for all the freight, they have all the risk up into the named place in the country of destination, and in DDP, the seller is also responsible for duties, taxes, and import clearance costs in the country of import. Here is a slide which has a chart that kind of makes it kind of easy to visualize the 3 legs of the export journey in a typical international shipment. So if you look going from the left to the right, the first leg of the shipment is what we call pre-carriage, which is basically the inland freight from the seller's door to the port of export. And in the middle box, we are connecting from the port of export to the port of import. We call that main carriage. And then the last leg of the journey is what we call on carriage, which is from the port of import to the buyer's door. We're also going to see 2 lines. We're going to have a risk line and a cost line. And we have the blue line, which represents the seller's responsibility. And then we have the dashed red line, which represents the buyer's responsibility. So you can visualize in X works, we see that the seller has virtually no risk or cost, and the buyer has all the risk and all the costs from the seller's door all the way to their door. On the delivered duty paid slide, we now see, when we look at the risk and the cost lines, we see that the seller is incurring all of the risk for loss or damage in transit, all the way from their door to the buyer's door, and they have all the freight costs. They're paying for pre-carriage, main carriage, and on carriage, all the way to the named place in the country of import. And remember, in DDP, the seller also is responsible for all duties and taxes and other import-related costs and tasks to get the goods cleared through customs in their customer's country. Now we have 2 examples of pro forma invoices, which are basically quotes when the exporter is preparing a quotation to sell a product to a customer in a foreign country. The first example we will look at is a pro forma invoice where we are quoting a customer when the Incoterm rule is X works. And the second example, we will look at an example when we are quoting on delivered duty paid terms. In the X works example, the exercise here is that we're trying to figure out, if we're the exporter, what are some of the costs that we're going to incur for this transaction? And in X works, the seller is not responsible for any of the freight costs or any of the risk. So in this example, we're going to pretend that we're selling a full coupling to a customer in Mexico, and that we're not incurring any abnormal or extra export packaging costs. So our ex-works quoted price to our customer is essentially no different than our material price, which is the price that we would sell here domestically for the product. And what we would do as we go through any other Incoterm rules where the customer is incurring some freight costs, we would be marking up in our quotation those costs to our customer so that we can help to build in those freight costs in our export quotation. On this slide, we have our pro forma invoice quotation example if we as the exporter were quoting DDP. And so you can see we would have to pay for all the freight. So we're going to our freight forwarders, to our carriers, getting freight estimates. So we're saying for the pre-carriage inland freight from our door in Erie to the port of export, and the forwarder fees, terminal handling fees, ocean freight, we're looking at, around $3,000 that we have to account for, that we're responsible for. Then we're paying for destination charges for the on-carriage freight, which we're building up into our quote. And then also we're responsible for duties and taxes. We're saying that's $700. So we have all these costs that we're building into our exported quote to our customer, in which case the Incoterm rule is DDP. In summary, there are 7 Incoterm rules which can be used for any mode of transportation, which means rail, truck, ocean, or air. And these are the 7 listed on your screen here. And we have 4 Incoterm rules which should be used for ocean or inland waterway transportation only for main carriage. Some tips for Incoterms 2020. From a buyer's perspective, if they want to maximize control of the supply chain, we suggest using FOB, FCA, or FAS so that the freight forwarder is working on your behalf. You should always place a named place after the Incoterms rule. Remember that the Incoterms are negotiable between seller and the buyer. They should appear on all your commercial documents. So on your commercial invoice or your sales contracts, it should clearly state which rule you're using and what the named place is. And it's important to establish a close relationship with a freight forwarder for Incoterms assistance or questions that you may have. This concludes our presentation on the summary of Incoterms 2020. If you have any questions, please contact us at any time. My email address is on the screen, as well as our phone number, and we look forward to helping you out. Thank you.